Okay, good evening. This is part 11 of our series on the 8th chapter of Bava, and we are going to spend tonight on pages 86b and 87a. Last week we read a Mishnah that mentioned a number of cases where you might think that there wouldn't be boshet, but there is. And one of them, which is the case we're going to spend the evening on, is hamivayesh tasuma, somebody who humiliates a blind person. And the Mishnah that we read last week said that that person is obligated to pay boshet to the blind person. So the Gemara here says, Matnin de lo Rabbi Yehuda. That must mean that our Mishnah is not like Rabbi Yehuda. And we're going to spend most of tonight's class trying to figure out what it is that Rabbi Yehuda thought, or at least presenting three different versions of what he thought. We're actually not going to make an attempt to figure out which one is correct, but we're going to explain all three of them. Which is a little strange, because you would think that once we establish that the Mishnah disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda, you would think that that meant that Rabbi Yehuda is no longer all that important. But Rabbi Yehuda's position seems to be much more interesting to the Gemara than the Mishnah is. Possibly because it's exotic and peculiar, or possibly because we actually rule like it. It's all going to depend on your general philosophy about this kind of discussion. Okay. Ditan, as says in the Braita, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Suma ein lo boshet. Rabbi Yehuda says that a blind person does not have boshet. And we will derive that in a few minutes, but the Braita is not quite over. V'kach haya Rabbi Yehuda poter mechayvei galuyot, mechayvei malkiot, umechayvei mitot beit. And Rabbi Yehuda also exempted blind people from three different kinds of physical punishment. He exempted them from exile, which is when an accidental murderer has to run away to a city of refuge. That's called exile, even though you don't actually leave the country, but you're not allowed to stay at your house. You have to go somewhere else, so we call that exile. So blind people, according to Rabbi Yehuda, would be exempt from that. And also from chayvei malkiot, which is obligations of flogging, which is to say, if they commit a crime for which the normal punishment would be flogging, they are exempt from punishment. And also chayvei mitot beit din, which is death penalties carried out by a human court, that blind people are also not punished for crimes for which the ordinary punishment would be death. And that pretty much covers the non-monetary penalties that halacha has to offer. So in effect, what Rabbi Yehuda is saying is that blind people act with impunity according to the Torah. Not necessarily that there wouldn't be rabbinic penalties for criminal activity by blind people, but that the Torah doesn't have any penalties for blind people, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay, my time is Rabbi Yehuda. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's reason for, and we're going to go through each of these, but we're going to start out with just the reason why blind people don't have boshet. So it says Gamar einecha me'edim zonim. So he learned a gzera shava from edim zonim, from the fact that the words "your eyes" appear in both places. Let's look at both of these psukim, and then we'll figure out what it is that he's learning from this. Okay, so first we're going to go to Devarim 25:12. Oops, it's the wrong book. In Devarim 25:12, we are talking about the case, which I think we mentioned this last week, which is the one case where the Torah actually seems to talk about humiliation as a category for damages. Yeah, so let's actually start from 25:11. Ki yanatzu anashim yachdav, ish va'achiv. If men are fighting with each other, a man and his brother, v'korva ishet ha'echad latzil et isha, and the wife of one of them comes to try to rescue her husband, miyad makehu, from the person who's beating him, v'shalcha yada v'achzika b'mivushav, and she sent out her hand and she grabbed what the Torah describes as his mivushim, the things that are embarrassing, I guess, which classically we interpret this as meaning genitals, but it's important that the Torah describes it as something which causes boshet, literally, or that's the word it uses. And the Torah says, "Vekatzota et kapa," you will cut off her hand. We already established, I don't know, about 8 or 9 classes ago that means that's a monetary penalty, but it says you'll cut off her hand. Lo tachos einecha, your eye will not have mercy. Okay, so the idea here seems to be that you might say, well, this poor woman was just trying to protect her husband. Maybe we shouldn't punish her at all. No, you shouldn't take pity on her. She has to pay up because she did something that's humiliating to another person in public. And for that, there's a penalty, even if you had a good reason. And when it said don't have mercy on her, it said your eye shouldn't have mercy. Eyes, sorry. Now, the other pasuk is Devarim 19:21 in a completely different context, but with a similar phrase. So here we have Eidim Zomim. So Eidim Zomim are witnesses who invalidate a set of witnesses that have already come in a criminal case by testifying that the witnesses were in fact somewhere else at the time of the crime. Right, there are a lot of different ways that you can contradict witness testimony. You could say, no, I was there and I saw it and you're not describing it right. You could say, you're a liar and you always lie, so you're probably lying now too. You could say, you couldn't possibly have seen that because you don't have very good eyesight. Right? There are a lot of different things you could say in response to criminal testimony, but this is one very specific case where you say you couldn't have seen that last Tuesday at 2:00 in the afternoon because last Tuesday at 2:00 in the afternoon you were sitting in my living room eating cookies with me. I know where you were last Tuesday at 2 p.m. and you were with me and it wasn't with those other people. Therefore, you couldn't possibly have witnessed whatever you say you witnessed then. Okay, so in that very specific narrow case of Eidim Zomimim, the Torah says that you do to the disqualified witnesses what they were trying to do to the person they were trying to convict. And after that passage in the Torah, it says, "V'hanisharim yishmeu v'yira'u," and those that are left will hear and they will be scared. And they won't continue to do things like this terrible thing in your midst. And your eye will not have mercy. Nefesh b'nefesh, ayin b'ayin, shein b'shein, yad b'yad, regel b'regel. Your eye will not have mercy. A soul for a soul, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot. And here, like in the case, I guess, of all the other places we've seen these phrases, a soul for a soul is going to be taken to mean kill them if they were trying to commit murder, and all of the others are going to be read as financial penalties. But the point is that about these two very disparate cases, the case of the financial penalty for humiliation and the case of the Eidim Zomimim, those are the two places where the Torah says your eye should not have mercy. So Rabbi Yehuda says those two cases must be connected to each other. And it must be that the way that they're connected to each other has something to do with eyes. So he says, Ma hatam sumim lo, af hacha sumim lo. It must be that in both cases, people who can't see are not included. Now, you could point out that the eyes that are not supposed to have mercy are presumably the eyes of the court or the eyes of the community or the eyes of some sort of person in power who might be able to not carry out this law, not the eyes of the people in the court case itself. But that does not seem to be the direction Rabbi Yehuda wants to go in. As Gzera Shavas go, this is fairly straightforward. Okay, now he argued, though, or we said that Rabbi Yehuda argued that blind people were exceptions to 3 other categories of law. So now we need to go through them and see where he got those from. So mechayve galuyot. So how do we get that Rabbi Yehuda thinks that blind people don't get sent into exile if they commit murder by mistake? Detanya, below reot prat lasuma divrei Rabbi Yehuda. So here we need to look at the passage about the accidental murderer, which is at the very, very end of the book of Bamidbar. End of the second to last chapter. And I am here in chapter 35, verse 23. No, let's go back a bit. 1 second. Yeah, so not all the way back to the beginning, but let's go back to verse 20. Ve'im b'sina yadofenu, o hishlich alav b'tzdiya v'yamot. And if he laid in wait for him in hatred, or he threw something at him in an ambush, and the person died, oh, ba'evahikau, or he hit him in hatred, biyado, with his hand, vayamot, and he died, mod yumat hamaker rotzeach. In that case, the smiter will die because he's a murderer, right? That's not an accidental murder. If you lie in wait and throw something at somebody in an ambush, or you in hatred to lift your hand against somebody, I suppose there's a possibility you were trying to kill them, but you were certainly trying to commit violence against them, and that is not, it's not an accident. Yeah.
So let's say I threw an axe aiming to hit someone, and I didn't aim very well, and it hit someone else and killed another person. So that's not in this situation.
So that is definitely not accidental. You're definitely not going to exile, but I believe there's a machloket about whether we can give you a death penalty or not, because you didn't quite commit the crime you were trying to commit either. That, according to many people, I think maybe even according to the position we rule, like, falls into a donut hole in which there's nothing we can do to you. Keeping in mind that most of the Torah death penalties seem designed never to be carried out, and they have lots of holes in them like that. Okay, on to Pasuk 22. V'im befeta below eva hadafo. But if he if he hit him with not as a surprise without hatred, o ishlich alav kol kli blodstia, or he threw a tool at him without any kind of ambush, o b'chol even asher yamut ba, and not with any kind of rock that you would normally kill somebody with, below reot, without anyone seeing, vayapel alav vayamot, and it fell on him and he died. Oh, I'm sorry, not without anyone seeing, without the person throwing the rock or the tool didn't see the person that they threw it at. Right? This is being, if you're throwing rocks in places where there might be people, then that's an extremely foolish and dangerous thing to do, and it's terrible. You should certainly not do it. But it's not the same thing as throwing rocks at people on purpose in order to kill them. Right? That's the distinction we're making here. V'hu lo oyev lo, and he wasn't his enemy, v'lo mevakesh ra'ato, and he wasn't trying to do something bad to him, then etc. That's the case in which you're going to end up going to the city of exile when it's you didn't try to kill him, but it's your fault he's dead. Let's put it that way. Or you did something foolish and dangerous that you should have known might kill someone, and in fact it did kill someone, but you weren't trying to kill anybody, and certainly not this particular person. Okay, but when it said that you threw something and it hit somebody without you seeing them, so those are the words we're interested in, is right, without seeing. So Rabbi Yehuda says that means prat l'suma, it excludes a blind person, because he interprets this as, in order to be a person who happens not to have seen their victim on that particular occasion, it has to be that you might have seen people on other occasions, because otherwise that's not a meaningful category for you. Rabbi Meir pops up here and he says, wait a minute, that's l'rabot tasuma, that comes to include the blind person. It says you can be an accidental murderer without seeing. So clearly you can be an accidental murderer while being a blind person. So now we need to get a little deeper into why Rabbi Yehuda thinks that this is excluding instead of including. So my time of the Rabbi Yehuda. So what's Rabbi Yehuda's reason? So he would say to you, and this is taken from another passage about describing what it means to be an accidental murderer. Asher yavo el re'ehu bayar lachto veitzim. If he goes with his friend into the forest to chop wood, right? And this is the famous case where you go into the forest to chop wood and the handle is not properly attached to the axe head, and you swing the axe and the axe head goes flying into your friend's head and kills him. So Rabbi Yehuda says, if all I had was that pasuk about the two guys going into the forest to chop wood together, I would say afilu suma, that's even a blind person, because it doesn't say what kind of person it is. Apparently it's any kind of person. But now he says, Katav Rachmana below wrote, but I also have this other pasuk in Bamidbar that says, without seeing, that I thought the blind person was included, but now that phrase is coming to tell me that he's excluded. So Rabbi Meir, now we need to know what Rabbi Meir would say to that. Rabbi Meir, what does Rabbi Meir think of that? Katav Rachmana below ra'ot lemute. He says, you're right. The words without seeing, that's an exclusion. The katav rachmana bivli dat lemeute, and the Torah also says without knowing, which that's attached to the case with the wood choppers in Devarim, as a similar parallel verse. So there's two exclusions. There's an exclusion of without seeing and an exclusion of without knowing. And it's excluded twice. Have a mute achar mute. I have two different things that seem both to be excluding the same thing. They're both trying to exclude the case where you didn't know that this person was going to get hurt. The ain mute achar mute el rabot. And we have a principle that if you have two exclusions that seem to be excluding the same thing, that's really coming to add something. So Rabbi Meir says, I know what it's adding. What it's coming to add is a blind person. I just want to own that what just happened here is Rabbi Meir had a very reasonable, logical interpretation that seemed to be pshat of the words in which he said that without seeing means that it includes people who can't see. And we have now taken that and tossed it aside in favor of this technicality in which we have an exclusion plus an exclusion, or a double negative equals a positive, and we're just going to, grope around in the dark for something that it must be including, which I find a lot less satisfying, but the Gemara is a lot more satisfied with this version of Rabbi Meir. Okay, but what does Rabbi Yehuda do with Rabbi Meir? Rabbi Yehuda, what does Rabbi Yehuda think of that? Ahu bivli dat prat lemitz kavein hudata. Rabbi Yehuda says, I don't buy your argument because I don't think that the words without knowledge have anything to do with our case. I think that the words without knowledge are there to mean exactly what they sound like they mean, which is to say that you're not an accidental murderer if you knew the person was there. And I need those words to tell me that if you're throwing axe heads in the direction of a person who you know to be present, you're not an accidental murderer. So I'm just using them for their pshat. They're not extra for anything. Therefore, I only have one exclusion, and I'm going to use it to exclude blind people. Okay, that unsatisfyingly gets blind people, according to Rabbi Yehuda, out of exile. Chayve mitot beit din. Now, as for the death penalty, why is it that that Rabbi Yehuda thinks that blind people don't get killed if they do something that's a death penalty offense? Well, that's atya rotzeach michayve galiot. So once we determined that they don't go into exile, then now if we can find similar language about deliberate murder and accidental murder, then we can say deliberate murder and accidental murder both use the word rotzeach, they both use the word murderer, and therefore we can use Gezerah Shava to import details from the accidental murder case to the deliberate murder case. And we're going to say that deliberate murderers also aren't going to get punished if they're blind. And then he sort of waves his magic wand and says, and so you can see that nobody gets a death penalty if they're blind. This obviously requires at least one more logical step in which you say, if you don't get that death penalty, you don't get any other death penalty. It's not hard to imagine him making that step, but it's not actually here in the Gemara. Okay,
Deborah, sorry, just from the like Rotseach seems like it's a well-used enough term that it you can't be allowed to make a Gezerah Shava from the word Rotseach.
Good. So as it happens, there are words that are a lot more well used. There is at least one very famous Gezerah Shava based on the word Haya. Yeah.
But so what?
And the word that it's being attached to there isn't even Haya. It's a different word that they think has the same meaning in context. So the thing with Gezerah Shavas is that it is a dangerously powerful tool.
Right.
And we're going to follow I think it's the Ramban's version of how this operates, but I don't think anyone really disagrees. It's at least with the part I'm going to say here, which is that if you would just let anybody make up an Gezerah Shava they wanted, then you could in fact connect any two psukim in the Torah, especially if you would allow the word et, and you could say basically anything, right? And the text would no longer have any meaning at all. And that is why there is a principle, sort of a sub-principle to the idea of Gezerah Shava, is that you cannot make one up. You can only say Gezerah Shava if you inherit one from your teacher, which makes it very strange that we frequently have disputes about things that are based on Gezerah Shava, because if you can only, even between people who were students of the same teacher, so that's odd. And so it seems like it's something more like what you inherit from your teacher is, here's a list of the words that are connected to each other. You go figure out what the connection is.
Mm-hmm.
But there's something limiting about Gezerah Shava that you have to get from a teacher. You can't just make it up, because you are correct. Otherwise, you could do absolutely anything.
Right. And with the word murder regarding Mazid and Shogeg, what, and they're saying because the word Rotzeach was used in both cases, what would be the alternative? What would be an alternative description of killing somebody either on purpose or
the thing is, the truth is, the Torah has a fairly rich vocabulary for killing people. It's one of those things that there are multiple synonyms for, and it would have actually made a certain amount of sense if you wanted to be clear to have different words for accidental murder and for deliberate murder.
Right.
And the fact that the Torah doesn't, and in fact, every single time that it discusses accidental murder, it is accompanied by a definition of deliberate murder. The Torah does seem to be deliberately, at least comparing the two, if not actually muddying the waters between them.
So there is no word for accidental murder. It's just bishogeg, or
I mean, the Torah could have called this person, I don't know, a horeg or a memit or a makeh. Makeh does get used, but the problem is it gets used on both sides, so that doesn't help any. But it doesn't. It just keeps calling them a rotzeach. It calls both of them a rotzeach. And as I said, every time it defines one, it also defines the other. So it seems like they're living in a sort of a tension with each other, where they're not actually really completely distinct ideas. So as Gzera Shavas go, it's almost, these are two things that it's almost impossible to disentangle. And if the idea of Gzera Shava had never existed, we would still be interpreting one in light of the other. I think I don't think there would be a choice about. Because they're also always in physical proximity, so you could always make a hekesh instead. And ideas are just like actually being deliberately compared by the text of the Torah. So yes, that of all the things one has to be bothered about here, that one doesn't bother me.
Okay.
Sorry. Okay, but we're not making very much progress here. I've been talking slowly, and I want to keep doing that, but so we have to keep going. So that got us the death penalty. Now we need flogging. So chayve malkiot. How do we know that when the Torah says to whip people who commit crimes, or to flog them? I don't know. I use those words sort of interchangeably. Neither of them accurately really describes what the Mishnah says this is, but whatever. How do we know that blind people are exempt from that punishment? Atya rasha mechayve mitot beten. Because in the description of trying the accused for either a crime that has a penalty of death or a crime that has a penalty of flogging, the word guilty is used. Rasha is used about both of them. It's that this one is a relatively rare word. And so again, he's going to make a Gzera Shava and say that if you don't get death penalties, you also don't get flogged. Okay, so that was the first version of Rabbi Yehuda. The first version of Rabbi Yehuda has blind people being exempted from boshet, and then derived from that from all physical punishments. Okay, the second version of Rabbi Yehuda, these are additive, by the way. The second version of Rabbi Yehuda is everything we just said plus another layer. So Tanya Idach, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Suma in lo boshet. This one starts the same way as the last one did. Another Breita. Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person does not have boshet. V'chein haya Rabbi Yehuda potro michol dinim shabbat Torah. And likewise, Rabbi Yehuda would exempt him from all civil judgments in the Torah, meaning he can't be fined or charged money for anything that he does. And as I said, it seems to be additive. So in this case, it would mean that he can't get flogged or put to death or sent into exile or made to pay money. My Talmud Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's reason? Amar Kra. The Torah says, "V'shaftu ha'ida ben hamakeh uvein goel hadam al hamishpatim ha'ela." Okay, so here we are in Bamidbar Lamed Hey, which is the location of the last pasuk I read. So my Tanakh is still open. It's in fact the next pasuk after the last one I read. The Eidah, which I translated as congregation because we usually do, but Eidah in rabbinic thought is basically always a court, usually the Sanhedrin. So we'll say that the court will judge between the smiter and the blood redeemer. Al hamishpatim ha'ela, on these mishpatim. Now it seems like in the pshat of the pasuk, mishpatim should be laws about what constitutes accidental murder. Meaning, like, use these laws that I'm teaching you here in order to judge this case between the relative of the deceased and the accidental murderer to determine whether they're a deliberate murderer or not. But the word mishpatim is being used in our Gemara in the way that it often is in rabbinic thought, which is to mean laws about money. And it's not unheard of in the Torah either. In Parshat Mishpatim, which begins Ve'ila Mishpatim, these are the Mishpatim that God told Moshe to command the Jewish people. And what follows after that is a very long list of almost entirely property law. So saying that Mishpatim means property law is actually not unreasonable. I just don't think it's necessarily what it meant in that pasuk in the Pshat. But that is what Rabbi Yehuda thinks it means here. So you will judge between the Makeh and the Goel Hadam on these Mishpatim. And he says, Kol sheyeshno b'makeh u'v'goel hadam yeshno b'mishpatim. So the reason why these things are all in the same sentence is to tell you that anybody who's included as a potential accidental murderer or as a potential blood redeemer is also included in the laws of the Mishpatim. V'chol she'eino makeh Eino b'makeh u'v'goel hadam eino b'mishpatim. And anyone who's not included as an accidental murderer, a potential accidental murderer, or as a blood redeemer is not included in mishpatim. Okay, so that's why I said this is additive. In order for this derivation to work, to tell us that blind people are not included in civil law, it needs to already be the case that they're not included in exile, because we're deriving the fact that he's not included in civil penalties from the fact that he can't be an accidental murderer who gets punished with exile. Okay, that was version 2 of Rabbi Yehuda. Here's version 3 of Rabbi Yehuda. Tanya Idach, Rabbi Yehuda Omer Suma in lo boshet. Starts the same way. Another Braita, Rabbi Yehuda says a blind person doesn't have boshet. V'chein haya Rabbi Yehuda potro mikol mitzvot hamurot b'Torah. And likewise, Rabbi Yehuda would exempt him from all mitzvot that are said in the Torah. So Amar of Shisha Breder of Edi. So Rav Shisha Breder of Edi said, "My time at Rabbi Yehuda. What's Rabbi Yehuda's reason? I don't know why. And all the other times we asked what Rabbi Yehuda's reason was, we didn't quote who was asking the question. Here we did. I don't know whether it makes a difference. In any case, Amar Kra. So the Torah says, "Ve'ela hamitzvot hachukim v'hamishpatim." Right. This is in the beginning of one of Moshe's speeches to Bnei Yisrael in Sefer Devarim. He says, "These are the commandments and the statutes and the judgments." So Rabbi Yehuda says, "Kol sheyeshno b'mishpatim yeshno b'mitzvot v'chukim." He says mitzvot and chukim and mishpatim are all together in this pasuk. So it must be that if you're included in mishpatim, then you're included in mitzvot and chukim. And anyone who's not included in mishpatim, in judgments, is not included in mitzvot and chukim. So this again is additive. It depends on having already demonstrated that he's exempt, the blind person is exempt from civil law, and you're saying anyone who's exempt from civil law is exempt from all of the other mitzvot too. Okay, here's where the Gemara takes an interesting twist. Amar of Yosef. Rav Yosef said, "Meireish hava amina man amar li halacha Rabbi Yehuda." Yosef said, from the beginning, I would have said that if someone told me that the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda, that blind people are exempt from mitzvot, de amar suma patur min mitzvot, ka'avidna yom hatava l'Rabbanan, I would make a yom tov, I would make a hot party for the rabbis. My tama, why? Delom mafkidna ka'avidna mitzvot, because then I wouldn't be commanded, and I do mitzvot anyway. That would be amazing. I would be like the very best Jew, because you do mitzvot because you have to. I do mitzvot because I love God. And that would make me so happy that I would make a party for the rabbis if someone would just tell me that was true. V'hashta d'shamit lahad Rabbi Chanina. And now that I heard what Rabbi Chanina said, the Amar Rabbi Chanina, Gadol ha-mitzuveh ve'oseh mimi she'eino mitzuveh ve'oseh. Rabbi Chanina said the person who is commanded and does is greater than the person who is not commanded but does anyway. So now that I heard that, Manda Amar li ein halachak Rabbi Yehuda avid neyamatav al. Now, if someone would just tell me the halacha is not like Rabbi Yehuda, I would make a party for the rabbis. My tama, why? Dechi mafkidna ili agratfei. Because if I was commanded, I'm going to get more schar, more reward. So I want to note a couple of things about this. One of them is that we have this very important, very prominent rabbi who is blind. It seems he's blind from birth. And nobody suggests that that should get in the way of his being a rabbi, even at the same time as they're saying that he might be completely excluded from being a participant in anything in the Torah. No one has suggested that he can't be a learner and teacher of Torah. That's a really interesting situation. One could imagine other ways that could have turned out, but it didn't. The other thing is that Rav Yosef doesn't seem in any way emotionally caught up in the actual fact of being commanded or not being commanded. He is very interested in the question of whether he's a better person one way or the other. But the question of whether the Torah is actually talking to him and whether that would make him feel good or not, either that is just not a thing that makes him feel good or feel bad, or he just doesn't think that it's the sort of thing that's worthy of talking about. But he's all caught up in the system's own judgment of whether he's a better person one way or the other. And the question of whether when he recites the Torah, he thinks of God as talking to him, which would to me be an emotionally extremely important factor, does not seem to appear at all, which I find really interesting. This story of Rav Yosef, which appears in a number of places, here and in Eruvin, and in at least one other place, but I don't remember where, ends up being the classic location for discussing whether you can make a bracha on a mitzvah that you're not commanded to do. Because Tosfot looks at this story and they say, wow, Rav Yosef says if I'm not commanded, I would be really, really happy, just because that would make me a better person. Well, no one would be really happy about being told they couldn't ever make a bracha again. Therefore, he must know that he's going to be able to make brachot either way. He's going to be doing the mitzvot the same way either way. And it's just a matter of how much that makes him a good person or not such a terrific person. And so they say it must be that if you're not commanded, you can still make a bracha. Most of the rest of the medieval rabbinic world looks at that and says, well, I don't know, I could be happy without making brachot. Doesn't seem like a problem to me. And this is the place where I like to mention that it matters a lot whether the person who's reading the halacha shares your instincts about what's valuable. Because if you're the sort of person for whom life would never be the same again if you couldn't make a bracha, you really need Tosfot deciding your halacha for you, because the other people just don't understand you, and vice versa, probably. Now, this is why it's halacha is not a generic black box where you get the same answer no matter which rabbi you ask, and it really matters that your rabbis share your values, because two different rabbis can look at exactly the same words on the page and get totally different results, depending on what assumptions they walk in with about what makes people happy. No, it's not even talking about a halachic context here. We're just talking about their assumptions about when people are happy and when people are unhappy. And that turns out to make an enormous difference. Okay, that's what I have for this evening. Are there questions?
I would just, about the very last part here.
Mhm.
So if if the law isn't like Rabbi Yehuda, he says he would make a party for the rabbis, yeah, because then he's commanded. Well, since most people are commanded, the rabbis would get a lot of parties.
Well, I think most people, first of all, I think when he says he's going to make a party for the rabbis, he means his friends, right? He is a rabbi. So not like everyone should have to make a party for a different group of people that they're not a member of when they're happy. I think this is about making a party for your own friends because you're celebrating. But in Rav Yosef's own personal case, he doesn't know whether he's commanded or not. Most of us, whatever our legal status may be, we know what it is. But Rav Yosef is kind of living his life as Schrodinger's cat, but with his consciousness on the outside of the box. Right, at least I guess Schrodinger's cat also knows whether it's alive or dead. It's just Schrodinger who doesn't know whether it's dead. Right, Rav Yosef is stuck in this case. It's even weirder than that, in which he doesn't know about his own self, whether he's commanded in mitzvot or not. And I think we hear here both that he would like to have some understanding of what his status is. Like he doesn't want to be left hanging. And also that he thinks that there's a better way to be, although he changes his mind in the middle about what that would be. We don't have, by the way, have any information about how he actually practiced or whether he ever actually made a party for the rabbis. Although it would be nice to know that, but we don't. I feel like without Roni here, we don't get as many questions. But Roni just got engaged, so yeah, I imagine that's why they're not here. Okay, anything else? Okay, I will see you guys next Monday night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.